Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai his wife took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your servant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." That is why the well was called Be'er Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. This is one of those passages of the Bible that gives some people, in their minds, a basis and justification for not paying attention to the Bible or for rejecting Christianity. There are people who say, the Bible is full of all kinds of bad stuff. Why are you telling me that I should take the Bible seriously? The Bible has mass murders. The Bible has genocide. The Bible has polygamy. The Bible has slavery. The Bible has patriarchy, where men have all the rights and dominate women who have no rights. This is the world of the Bible. Why should I take that seriously? And people make that claim for different reasons. Sometimes they do it so that it frees them from any obligation to actually read the Bible and find out what it says. Sometimes people do it so that they can exploit what appear to be contradictions in the Bible as a basis to say, I'm going to believe the part of the Bible that I like, and I'm going to ignore the part of the Bible that I don't like. Sometimes people do it so that they can point the finger at Christians for being hypocrites, because Christians say that we need to follow the Bible, but they say to Christians, well, you yourselves don't follow the Bible, so why should I follow the Bible? People have all different reasons for doing this, and in some cases it's from genuine concern. It's from genuine doubt about how can this whole thing possibly make any sense. But, as Tim Keller of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City points out, just because something is in the Bible doesn't mean that the Bible condones that thing. And in fact, this is a perfect example of a narrative, a story, where if you know how to read a story, you can read the story and find that far from the Bible condoning any of these things, the Bible actually gives great reasons embedded in the story of why these things are bad and a bad idea. I mean, if you're looking for reason to believe that slavery is a bad thing, and that polygamy is a bad thing, and that men dominating women in their households and in society is a bad thing, look no further from this chapter right here in the book of Genesis. I mean, you got to have your eyes open, you got to be paying attention, but consistently we find that when these things show up in the Bible, bad things happen. These are bad consequences. This is the consequence of sinful human beings being sinful. Oppression is something that the Bible and that Christianity and that God consistently stands against. The Bible is one of the most powerful things, I would say the most powerful resource for liberation from oppression of any resource in the entire world or in all of history. What do I mean by oppression? Well, there's a couple of different things that you can think of with oppression, and these two, sometimes they come separately, usually they come together. One example of oppression is when there's somebody who has more power than you who says, I'm not going to let you do what you want to do for no other really good reason than that it suits me to keep you from doing it. That's oppression. So in other words, not that the person in power stops you from doing what you want to do because what you want to do could hurt somebody else, or because what you want to do would hurt the community, or because what you want to do might hurt yourself, but just you doing what you want to do makes my own personal selfish agenda more difficult to achieve. So it's easier for me and it's better for me and what I want if I exert the fact that I'm stronger than you to prevent you from doing what you want, and in fact to turn that to get you to do what I want. That's oppression. Another example of oppression that again is often linked with the first is where one person who has more power than another person, a person who has more power than you, treats you as less important, as less valuable than everybody else. And again, not treating you less valuable or less important or taking certain rights or certain privileges away from you because, for example, somebody else is able to do something that you can't do, or somebody else wants to do something that you're not willing to do, or because somebody else actually is weaker than you and therefore needs a sort of handicap to keep them in the game of life along with everybody else who are stronger than they are, but rather treats you as less or takes something away from you that they don't take away from everybody else for reasons like you have the wrong last name, or because you speak with a certain accent, or because you have some otherwise insignificant physical characteristic, or just because they don't like you very much. And when that happens, when people treat you in a way that makes you less, that is unequal to other people, solely for their own selfish interests, that's oppression. That's oppression. So it's oppression when somebody who's stronger than you exerts their power to take away your freedom, or when somebody stronger than you makes you less than other people just for themselves, and just for their own idea, and just for the way they like it. That's oppression. And the Bible stands against it. But the problem that a lot of people have with the Bible, and the reason a lot of people go to a text like this and say, the Bible, we can't believe it because of all this stuff here, is because the Bible's solution to the problem of oppression is a solution that modern people don't want to hear. Because modern people, confronting oppression in the world, of themselves being oppressed, or thinking that they're oppressed, or seeing other people being oppressed, have solutions that they come up with that the Bible says those solutions, the cure is as bad as the disease. That the solution to oppression is every bit as oppressive as the thing you're trying to liberate people from. See, what modern people think, what modern people like, what modern people think is the solution to oppression is for every individual person, as an individual, to be able to do and say and think and define themselves however they wish, and not to submit to any authority at all except for the authority that they want to submit to, which basically means they set themselves up as their own authority, and the authority that they want to submit to is an authority that doesn't cause all that much discomfort for them anyway. Or it's a discomfort for them that they don't mind, even though it's causing a great deal of discomfort to somebody else, or vice versa. This is what people want to do. The solution that modern people come up with to the problem of oppression is, you can't tell me what to do, I can do whatever I want. You can't tell me who I am, I'm whoever I choose to be. In fact, we just learned a couple of weeks ago from 5 justices on the Supreme Court that, and I quote, the Constitution promises liberty that allows persons to define and express their identity. This is what these justices said. They said this even though the Constitution does not do any such thing. The Constitution does not promise liberty that allows persons to define and express their identity. But they said this anyway because they realized that the overwhelming majority of Americans believe that to be the case. The overwhelming majority of Americans, whether liberal or conservative, believe that the heart of what it means to be an American is that I can define and express my identity. That I can say, this is who I am, and this is what I'm all about, and you can't say anything otherwise. Now, I wouldn't mind it so much if the Declaration of Independence promised liberty that allows persons to define and express their identity, but it doesn't. And I wouldn't mind that so much if the Bible promised liberty that allows persons to define and express their identity, but it doesn't either. Because what the Bible says is that the one who defines our identity is our Maker, our Creator, God. He is the one who defines our identity. We are made as precious possessions in His image and likeness. So our identity revolves around Him, all about Him. We read in Psalm 139 that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, that He knit us together in our mother's womb, that His thoughts about us are so great, are so vast, are so numerous that we cannot possibly imagine them. The God who made us is the one who defines our identity. And the only freedom that we can find is when we express the identity that He has given us, that He has made us. The very hairs of your head, Jesus says, are numbered. This is the God who not only created the billions and trillions of stars in the universe, but calls them out by name. We read in Isaiah 40, has named every single one of the stars. This God is the one who defines our identity. Now, the problem is that we have been made in this image of God, are also human beings in a structure of sin, that human beings are not what we're supposed to be. And the Bible also says that we're born in sin. We are born into sin. We are born into bondage to our sinful nature. To our default setting is wanting to rebel against God, wanting to go our own way. And our parents, they were the same way, and their parents, they were the same way. All of us were born into this matrix. All of us were born into this. And so because of that, we have these passions, and we have these desires, and we have these self-concepts and these thoughts about ourselves that don't accord with the definition and the identity that God has given us. So we want to do things that are not in accord with how God has defined us. And we feel this conflict, this clash between who we are and who God says we're supposed to be. And what human beings do is they rebel against God's definition of themselves to say, I'm going to define myself and do it my own way, which is monstrous, which is grotesque, which is the rebellion against God of saying, I'm not going to listen to you, I'm God. I'm the one who gets to determine what my identity is. And the wages of sin, the Bible says, is death. There's no future in that. No future at all, only pain. Whatever short-term liberation there might be from saying, this is who I am, in the long run, it's only pain and death and agony. It's true. But God has provided a solution. He's provided a way out. He sent His Son, God Himself, to become a human being, to restamp the image of God into humanity. So that by faith in Jesus Christ, Jesus, who is the image of God, can recreate the image within us. This beautiful, wonderful statement that Jesus makes in Revelation 2:17, when He says, to the one who overcomes, in this beautiful, picturesque, symbolic image, to the one who overcomes, I will give him a white stone with a new name written on it that no one knows but the one who receives it. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? To the one who overcomes, I will give a white stone, a pure stone that has a name written on it, your definition, who you are, that nobody else knows, only you know, that's individual and unique to you, that's special to you, but it's given by Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It's given by Him. It's defined by Him. And that is our liberation. That is our liberation. But that's not a message that the world wants to hear. So that's a long digression. But it's an important one. I really needed to say that today. But how does that swing back to this? The way it swings back to is right here in Genesis chapter 16. It's quite simply this. When you are oppressed, the solution is God. When you are oppressed, the solution is the God who hears and sees. It's not from you rebelling. It's not from you fighting. It's not from you struggling and striving to assert yourself and express yourself. The solution to oppression is the God who hears and sees. That's what we see here in Genesis chapter 16. We need to take ourselves back 4,000 years ago. We need to enter into the shoes of these people, the sandals of these people in this world, this oppressive world with oppressions that look similar and yet different to the oppressions of our own world, and understand what's going on here. We have a situation where, as we know, Abram has no children. And he has a wife named Sarai. They've been together for many, many years. And she's provided him no children. We've talked in past weeks about how serious that was. About how for people in that place, in that day, at that time, that to have children who carry on your name, that was the way you carried on after you died. You know, we see very, very little to nothing about an afterlife at this point in the Bible. We don't know that Abram had any knowledge of an afterlife at this point. But what he knew was that what would continue on after he died was his children, and he knew that he had no children. He had no place for all of his great wealth and possessions to go and to carry on, and for his name to carry on. So this is a problem for him. It was also a problem for his wife Sarai. It was a problem for her because in her world, in her culture, she had one job. One job. As a woman, she had one job. Bear a child, preferably a son. That was it. One job. She couldn't do it. She couldn't do it. Try as she might, she couldn't do it. And so the feeling of purposelessness and meaningless and hopelessness and of shame, because nobody at that point was thinking, well, it's the man's fault. You know, it was always, if there wasn't a child being born, it was the woman's fault. And so that experience was just overwhelming and crushing. And because of that, what wealthy men did at that time, what they were prone to do, is to take a second wife. And by the way, we can look in Genesis, the first time somebody takes a second wife, that's in Genesis chapter 4. It's the person who's the seventh descendant from Cain who murdered his brother. And the guy who took two wives, Lamech, was a bad dude. Okay, so polygamy is regarded as a bad thing from the very beginning of Genesis. But what men would tend to do is they would take a second wife who hopefully could provide the child that the first wife could not provide. But in some cases, if it was a very exceptionally wealthy household, then the wife might have a slave who would be serving her, that then she could take her own initiative to give her slave to her husband as a concubine, so that a child born to that slave would count as her own child. It would count as her own. And that's why Sarai says here, she says, go sleep with my maidservant. This is in verse 2. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Literally, perhaps I can be built through her. Perhaps I can be built up. Perhaps I can be somebody. Perhaps I can achieve my destiny through her. If she bears a son, it will count as my son, and then I will have completed my job. I will have done the one thing that I'm supposed to do. I will have fulfilled my function in our marriage, in our relationship. Now, the situation there is that when that would happen, when there would be a concubine, what happened was it was a promotion for that slave. The slave gets promoted from ordinary slave to concubine, but that promotion is not as high as the rank of regular wife. Okay? So it's a step up, but it's not a step all the way up. But what happens with Hagar is that as she gets promoted, she thinks she gets promoted higher than she is. So once she is promoted from slave to concubine, she's in this situation where she's now neither slave nor wife. She's both slave and wife. She's both Sarai's slave and Abram's wife, which means in a certain way she's neither. She's better than the average slave, but she's not at the same rank as Abram's wife Sarai. She's in this position that's kind of in between. And she takes this step as she gets promoted. Once she sleeps with Abram. Now again, from your perspective, from my perspective, we might be thinking about the horror of this, the horror of being owned, the horror of being possessed, the horror of your mistress saying, you're going to go sleep with this person tonight. Get in there and do it. I mean, that kind of forcible sexual encounter is a severe thing. But from Hagar's perspective, She seemed to be looking at this as an opportunity. This is an opportunity to step up in the world, in her world that was confined by her ownership. And so when she conceives right away, she begins acting as if she's on a peer level with Sarai. And not only on a peer level, a peer rank, but also because she's born the child that Sarai couldn't bear, she's better than Sarai. She's not only a full-on wife with Sarai, but she's a better wife than Sarai is. And so we read that she began to despise her mistress in verse 4. You can imagine Hagar. She's finally made it. She's in the money. She's now the wife of this extremely powerful, extremely wealthy, nomadic shepherd with all of these thousands of cattle and sheep and goats and all of these other slaves and all this silver and gold, and now she's his wife. She's probably already picking out what tent is going to be hers, her own special place that she gets to be. She's picking out the special cushions and blankets and what she's going to buy from the next caravan that comes through to set that place up. She's got it all figured out. Abram's going to love me now. His wife, she's old. She's not delivering. I'm going to be the favorite now. She's got this all figured out. And Sarai is incensed. Now, Abram should have seen this coming. Abram should have seen this coming. If you note, Abram, who all along in this story, Abram has been the main character. He's been the main character all along. And here in this story, Abram is passive. He's passive. Notice in verse 2, Abram agreed to what Sarai said. He never speaks. He never talks about it. He just says, okay. He'd been given a promise by God in the previous chapter that through his own body, descendants would come that would be more numerous than the stars in the sky. And Abram is probably reasoning, well, maybe this is the way that God plans to deliver it. Why didn't I think of this before? Even though he probably should have figured out that the nature of God's promise in chapter 15 required a miracle. But Abram just listens and passively does what Sarai says. An interesting thing here, if you look carefully at the language, especially in the Hebrew, in chapter 16, it compares very, very similarly to the language in Genesis chapter 3. What happens in Genesis chapter 3? A snake is talking to a woman. And she says, and he says, did God really say not to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And the woman said, that seems like a good idea. And she took the fruit and she gave to her husband, who listened to her, and he ate. Very, very similar language right here. The author of Genesis is indicating to us this is a bad thing that's about to go down. And husbands, I got to tell you, this is a bad thing that's about to go down. It's a bad thing. I'm going to talk to the husbands just for a second, okay? So wives, this is not talking to you, okay? This is not for you. But husbands, I got to tell you, it actually is for you wives. But husbands, here's the thing. The yes, dear thing is always a bad idea. It's always a bad idea. It is not a good thing. It is not a good thing. It is always a good thing to listen to our wives. Always a good thing. It is always a good thing to sacrifice for our wives. It is always a good thing to serve our wives. It is always a good thing to take our wives' needs more seriously than we take our own needs. But it's always a bad idea to do what our wives want and to do what our wives say simply because of passivity, simply because we don't want to deal, simply because we don't want to have the stress of the conversation, simply because we don't want her mad at us, simply because it's going to go easier that way and that's the path of least resistance. That's always a mistake. It's always a mistake in the Bible. It was a mistake for Adam. It was a mistake for Abram. It was a mistake for Ahab, whose wife was Jezebel. It's always a mistake. It's never good. Husbands, we got to step up as men and take leadership in our households. And wives, I should tell you right now that we husbands are terribly afraid of you. We are very afraid of you. I'm not lying. This is true. I mean, the husbands, they may or may not admit this, but this is true. We're terribly afraid of you. No matter how tough we might seem and no matter how tough we might be and how strong we might be in our workplaces or whatever else, we are terribly afraid of our wives. We are terrified that you're not going to like us. We're terrified that you're going to think we're stupid. We're terrified that you're going to leave us. We're terrified that you're going to nag us endlessly. We're terrified that the one person, the only person in the world really that we desperately want to admire us will not admire us. And you have an enormous amount of power, and there are some men who react to that in vicious, violent ways. But there are many of us, and probably most of us, who react to it by passivity. And that is never a good thing. That is never a good thing. Always good to actively and intentionally submit and serve our wives. Never a good idea just to do it for the sake of keeping the peace. And that's what Abram does. And there are bad consequences. Sarai now sees her slave, Hagar, treating her as less than. And whoa, watch out. Watch out. There's verses in the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 30, 21 through 23. It says this, "Under 3 things the earth trembles. Under 4 it cannot bear up. A servant who becomes king, a godless fool who gets plenty to eat, a contemptible woman who gets married, and a servant who displaces her mistress." That could have been written, maybe was written, with Genesis 16 in mind. And the earth under Abram's tents could not bear up under this situation. And Sarai, again, it's not strong enough in the NIV. There should be exclamation points after all this. In verse 5, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering." Literally, in the Hebrew, it's violence on you. That's what it says. Violence on you. My violence on you. So the violence that's been done to me, that's your fault, Abram. The injustice and the oppression that I've suffered, may it be on your head. It's a curse. Sarai curses Abram. So this is your fault. If you would just keep her in line, I put her in your bosom. But then you just let her go do this thing. It's irrational. It's senseless. But she's angry now. She's angry. She's on the warpath. What does Abram do? Again, passive. Your servant's in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best. I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to hear about it. I want to watch TV. It didn't have TV back then, but I don't know. I want to watch the camels run around. I don't know what Abram watched. I don't know what he did, but I don't want to deal. I don't want to deal. My life's going to be better off if you're happy, so whatever it takes to make you happy, honey, go ahead and do that thing. And so what does Sarai do? She oppresses Hagar. She's saying, I'm going to chop her down to size. I'm going to show her who's boss. I'm going to reestablish authority in this house. And Hagar's oppressed. We don't know how. We don't know if it was language. We don't know if it was with beatings. We don't know if it was with ceaseless work. It was probably kicking her out of whatever tent she was in. But it was so bad that now Hagar's had the experience. She was oppressed as a slave, as property, and now she almost ascends into liberation, and then bam, slammed back down again. It's as if it was worse than if she had never been elevated, as if she had never been pregnant. And what does she do? She runs away. She runs away. And when she runs away into the desert, she encounters someone. Someone called the angel of the Lord, the angel of Yahweh. Now, the angel of the Lord doesn't show up very often, but the angel of the Lord is not a typical angel. The angel of the Lord is a technical term. Because the thing with the angel of the Lord is that on the one hand, it's not the Lord, but on the other hand, it talks like it is the Lord, and people bow down and worship this angel, and unlike the other angels in the Bible, who when people bow down to him, they say, "Get up, don't worship me," when people bow down and worship this angel, the angel accepts it. So this is a being that is both not the Lord and the Lord, and for that reason, many Christians, myself included, believe that the angel of the Lord is actually Christ. That the angel of the Lord is actually the Son of God appearing before his incarnation. And so if this is the case, if this is Jesus appearing to her, he finds her and he asks her a penetrating question, which would be the kind of thing that Jesus would do if you ever read the Gospels. This is the sort of thing he does. He says, "Hagar, servant of Sarai," reminding her what she really is, "where have you come from, and where are you going?" And what does she answer? "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai." That's where she comes from. She doesn't know where she's going. She's not going anywhere. She's vaguely running back to Egypt, where she's from, but she doesn't know where she's going. And in fact, whatever oppression that she's just run from in Abram's camp, she is setting herself up for a lot worse. Because as a woman, alone, in a desert, she was bound to be captured by somebody and made a slave. Bound to be. It was inevitable. And whoever captured her was likely to be way worse than Abram was. and even worse than Sarai was. And so here she is. She's run from oppression, but she's got nowhere to go. And how true is that of people? People doing whatever they can to redefine themselves or to define the rest of the world or to say to the whole world, you've got to accept me the way I am, or to get out of this situation or get out of that situation or move to that city or get out of this marriage or whatever it is. I got to get out of oppression, and there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go but to fall into that same oppression someplace else. And it might even be worse. There's no solution there. There's no answer there. That's not the way to go. And the angel of the Lord tells her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. And see, that's the language that nobody in modern times wants to hear. Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear, go back and submit. Go back to the oppressive place and voluntarily, willingly submit despite how hard it is. Nobody wants to do that. But the angel says, if you do it, I'm going to increase your descendants. And they're going to be great and they're going to be powerful. And we'll see more about that next week. But what he says is, he says, you're going to call this son's name Ishmael, which means God hears, because the Lord has heard you. And then Hagar herself calls that God, you are the God who sees me. And she says in verse 13, I've now seen the one who sees me. There's different ways of rendering it. It might be, I see the back of the one who sees me. It might be, am I now really seeing after he saw me? He saw me, and have I really lived to tell about it? And that's why the well is called the well of the living one who sees me. Be'er l'chai ro'i, the well of the living one who sees me. The answer to oppression, the answer to your oppression, is the God who hears and sees. The God who hears and sees. And what's Hagar's response? Hagar goes home, and she talks to Abram. And when she bears the child, Abram calls the child Ishmael, which means that Hagar told Abram what happened. It means she testified. It means she said, the God that you're talking to here and there, that like we actually went from all these places to all these other places to show, and we wander around because of this God that you can hear and see that none of the rest of us can. I just saw him. And I just heard him because he heard and saw me. See, God hears you and sees you first. He hears you. When you're oppressed, he hears you. Believe it, he hears you. When you're oppressed, he sees you. Believe me, he sees you. And he hears you and sees you so that you can hear and see him. But hearing and seeing him will mean nothing unless you do what he says. It means nothing unless you do what he says. It means nothing unless you take his definition of you rather than defining yourself. My friends, we all have an opportunity to either testify to God's grace, to either say to a fellow disciple, hey, God has heard me. God has seen me. To say to a not yet disciple, God has heard me. God has seen me. Or if you're not a disciple yourself, to say, God hears me. God sees me. I'm finally going to listen to him. Amen. I'm finally going to do what he says. I'm finally going to accept him as my Savior. I'm going to trust him. I'm going to test him. And I'm going to experience eternal life. In the bulletins that you received when you came in, or in the seat in